I'm Kevin Burke, and my new podcast is about growing up. Whoever you are, you come from a specific place and time, surrounded by characters who are larger than life. In our first season, everybody we meet is different, but what they have in common is they were all young at some point in the same town.
Right there, that was a snippet of the new podcast, Your Hometown Podcast, which talks about where we're from and how it shapes us. To talk more about the podcast and to give us more context is the host himself, Kevin Burke. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. What can first-time listeners expect from your podcast?
Thank you and good morning, Tabitha. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been such a meaningful experience to work on this show. This is, as you said, a show about where we're from and when we're from and how that unique intersection of time and place and our coming of age years shapes us forever. And so the very first season is a deep dive into New York City, where I interview more than 20 prominent New Yorkers from all areas of the city, all 5 boroughs and beyond, about how growing up here in this, a remarkable, diverse, electric city shaped them in the deepest ways. And what's interesting about childhood is that when we're young, the scale of our world is very small. And so, we're talking about, people like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Al Sharpton or Maria Bartiromo. Today we're releasing an episode with Sigourney Weaver.
Yeah.
You get the sense that, it's the childhood bedroom, the home, the street, the block, the school that define who we are. And as one of our guests said, tattoo us forever.
It certainly does. And what about some other notable guests? Like you said, Sigourney Weaver dropping today. What have you learned from your interviews with them?
It's really been remarkable. I think on a personal level, there are events in people's lives, especially famous people, before we ever meet them or the world meets them, that mark them in profound ways. So there can be very personal events. So, for example, Sherilyn Ifill, who's the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, she lost her mom when she was 5. And that event marked her in a deep way. Or Sigourney Weaver, who attended an all-girls school, found her voice there and actually found her name Sigourney. And also Al Sharpton, he was a remarkable guest. I interviewed him not long after the murder of George Floyd. And, a lot of people who've grown up around or seen Al Sharpton, especially here in New York, they can't picture him as a kid. He's one of those people that just seems like they emerge as an adult. But of course he was. And when I interviewed him, he said that little boy inside of him is right there at the surface. And what I thought was the most profound was that when Reverend Al was a kid, his father left, abandoned the family and took off. And when he was a little boy, he would sit at his bedroom window every night wondering if his father would be coming back home and pulling into the driveway. And he said that when he has to address a family, especially children who've lost a parent to police violence or to anything, any loss, that's his go-to place. That experience deep inside of him of seeing his father leave and not come home, that's how he connects his pain to the pain that he's seeing before him. And I think everyone can relate to that we have events in our childhood that are right near the surface. I like to liken it to a kind of a needle dropping on a record. Yeah. That particular memory's there on cue. And even though as we age, we're always furthest in time from our childhoods, those events remain closest to the surface and deepest inside of us. They're almost mythic in our memories.
They certainly are. And I'm from Texarkana, Texas. I kind of call San Diego home because I've spent the last 8 years there. But the reality is I grew up in the small town of Texarkana. And I want to know, what is your hometown and how did it shape you?
Deeply. So I grew up 60 miles north of New York City in a town called Newburgh, New York. And it's interesting because I was there from birth to the age of 18. My family has been there for a long time. And then after being away in school for a decade in Boston, I moved back. And so I've had the experience of living there as a child and as an adult. Yeah. I now live in New York City with my wife and kids. But Newburgh is interesting. It operates on multiple levels. But whenever I go back there, I feel like I'm sort of re-entering as that 15-year-old self.
Yeah.
And I keep tabs on the town. And I noticed that even in sort of the online community, people on Facebook and Twitter who have moved away, they keep tabs on it too. Sure. I just think it's that place. I remember watching an interview with the director of the Black Panther movie and Ryan Coogler, and he was asked about why, when he filmed the Black Panther, did he frame the movie with shots in Oakland, where he was from. And he said that for him, even though he still lives in the Bay Area, that place, that town where he grew up, even though it no longer exists, right, as he experienced as a kid, it's changed. But for him, that was his Wakanda, right? That's where he's from. That's his mythos. And I very much relate to that when I think of Newburgh, this little town north of the city on the Hudson River. You know, you can drive through it in a few minutes. It's 4 square miles, but for me, it's an epic place. And as I've gotten to know people through the series, these prominent individuals, I think for each of them too, these blocks, these apartments they grew up in, looking out the window, riding the subway, playing in the schoolyard, they are also their mythological places too. They feed us in a certain way, they haunt us in certain ways, and the people and places of those childhood experiences loom large as we age through life.
Kevin, I could talk to you about this all day, but I want to know just a little bit more about you and your background. You're also a producer, a historian, a journalist.
Yeah, so I think that what connects them all is that I'm a storyteller. And I think that's how I discovered my passion for history. And my study, I think, bolstered me in that. I think what I bring to this experience is both a deep connection to my own experience of coming of age and loving to interview people and talk to them about where they're from.
Yeah.
But also the historian in me has the context for being able to put anyone's place or time in a certain sense of understanding. So, for example, when I interviewed Sigourney Weaver, she mentioned how when she was growing up, like a lot of people her age, she had a crush on John Lennon. She was around when the Beatles first came to the United States. And then she mentioned in the course of the interview that the first time that she felt like an adult in the city was when she got her own apartment. She had grown up on the east side of the city and moved to the west side. And I asked her where. She said, oh, it was across from the Dakota building. And in that moment, I realized, well, that's where John Lennon lived, in the Dakota. And if you were moving there in the late 70s, were you around when he was murdered? And of course, that opened a window for her memory that she was there. And she was there the night that he was killed. And she remembered the exact play that she was reading for a part that she was looking to land. And she heard the gunshots, and she went downstairs as the crowd was gathering and mourning and singing Give Peace a Chance. So I think for me, the historian in me is able to put each person's life and place in context and then use it as a way to make a connection to understanding how parenting has changed over time, how childhood has changed, and what are the sort of public events that mark us. So, for example, a lot of focus right now is on the pandemic and how that's going to mark childhood. But that's true for any generation. There's the 9/11 generation. There's a generation that lived through, in the late 70s in New York City, the disappearance and murder of a boy named Eitan Pates. Yeah. And one of our guests, Lynn Nottage, is a prominent 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, was 15 at the time, and she said that was the dividing line of childhood. When that boy went missing, and ultimately we learned later that he was murdered, that changed childhood completely, because before that you could roam the city in a carefree way, and even though there were dangers, it didn't seem to penetrate childhood. After that, parents were wary of sending their kids out with any parameter. So each generation is marked by big events, and of course personal events that are private, that an historian can unlock.
Absolutely, Kevin. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on NBC LX. Again, the podcast is Your Hometown Podcast for people who want to check out Sigourney Weaver, who drops today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And like I said, I have a great partner in this first season, the Museum of the City of New York. It's wonderful partnering with them to tell this local story from the bottom up through the lives of people who we think we know. But in this series, we get to know the first chapter of their lives, which is often the most overlooked, but the most fascinating.
Absolutely. Thank you.